So, Dragonsong's Reprise Ultimate. I've made plenty of videos on the fight over the last few weeks, but I've never actually talked about the content thus far, and I've been meaning to do that for quite some time now. So now that me and my group managed to clear it a few days ago, I thought this would be the best time to go ahead and do just that. We've waited, I think it must have been about 2 years or so at this point for this fight to come out, ever since it got delayed way back when in Shadowbringers, so the anticipation was quite high, but the fight was well worth the wait. This is easily the most ambitious encounter that they've ever created in the game, and it was so exciting to not only proc through the fight myself, but also follow other groups go through it. Unfortunately enough, my group couldn't get started until 2 weeks after it released, so I ended up watching a bunch of streams of either big streamers or my friends that were progging the fight, and it was really exciting every time that they managed to get to a new point that no one had been to before yet. Now, the reason why I say that the fight is ambitious is because it does some things that haven't been done before, or not in an ultimate at least. First thing was the checkpoint. This got such a mixed reaction once people found out about it, and looking back on it, we were so wrong. People were saying that it doesn't matter how hard they make the mechanics now, we have checkpoints so we can just quickly retry again, it's too easy. But after seeing more of the fight, the checkpoint makes sense, and there's also only one of them, like 2 minutes into the 20-minute or so fight. So the fight definitely wasn't made easy just because we got a checkpoint. Instead, it feeds into the story that is being told. Ultimates have mainly just been a gauntlet of old bosses that we're fighting, with not too much story elements in place, but for DSR it's different. Sure, we have the retelling of the Dragonsong's war, but once that story is done, we go into a what-if scenario, and then we also go into the secret mechanics that we've come to expect from Ultimates. Now, this time around, things weren't super obscure, like with the Codex in Alexander Ultimate. What needed to happen, or what you could try, was quite obvious. The first special thing that we had to do was save Haurchefant. Now, I'm pretty sure that the first time people got to the end of the door boss, they will have tried to save our boy to no avail. However, the door boss was the first clue. You don't have an LB3 there, and I don't mean in the sense that you can't build LB3 in time, I mean that you're only granted 2 LB bars, which I'm pretty sure that this is the first 8-man encounter that does this, so we knew something was up. So when we then rewinded back in time to that moment, and we do have an LB3 at this time, it was kind of obvious what needed to happen. Of course, people had to figure out which one of the 3 to use, but that's only a matter of trial and error. We also know that we needed to save Haurchefant there, because when we don't, the fight just repeats and goes back to what we were doing before. So now the checkpoint is making a whole lot of sense. The second secret is that we have to spare Thordan in phase 5. At the end of the phase, once you get him down to 2%, he will stop whatever he's doing, even if he's casting the Enrage, and start begging for us to spare him. You can either kill him or spare him, whichever you choose. You can continue into phase 6, but depending on your choice, you might not be able to go into phase 7. After you clear phase 6, the 2 eyes come back from phase 4, and if you kill Thordan, then it plays out almost exactly like phase 4. So for those that don't know how phase 4 works, you have to kill both eyes of Nidhogg, and to be able to deal damage to them, we need a buff. One comes from Lady Iceheart, one comes from Haurchefant. But this time around, in this timeline, Haurchefant is alive, so he can't be there to give you this buff, so you can only damage one of the eyes, and thus you'll die because the other eye won't take much damage. So if you spare Thordan's life though, he'll show up and take control over both eyes and become Dragon King Thordan. So again, little secret interaction, but you can see him begging for mercy at the end of phase 5, so you can just try to spare him and see what happens. Again, not so obscure. I quite liked how they went about it this time around. I think T was just too hidden and also didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but the secret interactions in this fight were well designed, and I also like how it ties into the story that is being told. I've seen some people speak out about not being too happy that new story is locked behind an ultimate encounter, but this isn't like actual story, it's just a fan fiction essentially, and you can just watch a clear video of it, but I can understand people wanting to experience it for themselves. For me, I'm not too bothered either way, even if I wasn't someone that does these fights, just watching streamers go through it or watching a clear POV would have been more than enough for me personally. But it's nice to see what the what-if scenario would have been like, because I'm sure that a lot of people would have wanted Haurchefant to live, and now we sort of know how things would have turned out if he did. As for the encounter itself, pretty long fight, as I've mentioned before, including the door boss. It's about 20 minutes or so, which even for an ultimate is long, and it doesn't have a break cutscene either like you have with the others. In UCOP you have the final phase transition where you die and then Phoenix comes in to resurrect you. For Ultima you have the part where he absorbs the 3 primals, and for Alexander you have the cutscene where he transforms into Perfect Alexander. This time around we don't really have any of that. Although I guess the Dragon King Thordan transition does take a little while, but you're still healing and putting up mitigation there, so it's not just AFK for a minute to mentally prepare for the final fight. However, I do feel like we got plenty of mini breaks between most of the phases. Between 1 and 2 we have a whole checkpoint, so you can take as long as you want over there, but there's a fair amount of time between each phase starting from phase 3. After you kill Nidhogg you have some time before you can hit the eyes. Then we have the rewind and the forward cutscenes, Thordan begging for his life, and then the Dragon King transition. So we do get enough places where we can take a little bit of a breather, but you're never completely taken out of the action like I feel is the case with the other ultimates. I'm not sure if I prefer one over the other, but I didn't really miss having that long cutscene in the fight, and I felt like the small pauses were more than enough. For the phases themselves, Phase 1 is actually a pretty good door boss in the sense that it tells you this is ultimate. Everything hurts, you need to be careful with your DPS because both bosses need to die like 1 second apart from each other, and there's also some very tight dodges that have to happen, which that comes back a lot throughout this fight, so it's a good phase to set up the rest of the fight. Phase 2 looks pretty overwhelming when you just see the mechanics, but it's really not that bad. The main thing that can screw you over here is getting the cursed tower pattern on the second trio, so it was always a bit rip when we got that one, but sometimes we managed to squeeze those meteors in, and then that lit up the atmosphere in the group a bit, because we always go into that pattern expecting a wipe. So I'm also really glad that this is at the beginning of the fight, because if this was like a final phase mechanic, where you could get cucked out of a clear just because you landed on the 1 in 16 pattern, that would just feel really bad. Phase 3 then, Nidhogg. This is definitely one of the better phases of the fight. The wormhole mechanic, as people call it, is really well designed, and it doesn't matter how many times we've done it at this point, it's very satisfying to see all the pieces come together perfectly, and the pacing of the mechanic is also really well done. It has a nice rhythm going for itself. The rest of the phase is kind of whatever though, but I don't really mind that too much, as it's kind of like a breather that you get for doing the hard part of the phase correctly. Phase 4, the eyes, this is the most chill phase of the fight. Just be mindful of the tether passes and you'll be fine. Don't think it's too healing intensive, DPS check is also super easy, and the mechanics also aren't too bad. That combined with the music makes for a very relaxing part of the fight. Rewind transition is quite healing intensive, but it's kind of made up for the fact that the DPS check is non-existent. You'll have your 2 minutes there, so the boss will just evaporate, and thus your healers can just focus on healing and nothing else, which is also kind of needed, as there's a lot of outgoing damage there. They need to keep Haurchefant alive, then there's the constant AoE coming from the spear being blocked, on top of people also taking the cleaves from the boss. So a lot of outgoing damage that needs to be healed and mitigated, and you also need to make sure that you do the movement correctly so that no one accidentally gets clipped by a cleave or a puddle that is being dropped. Then we go into phase 5, which is the Rewind Thordan, or Dark Thordan as people have been calling him. This is one of the phases where I'm really glad that we didn't have to figure out the mechanics for ourselves, because progging this must have been a nightmare, but now that we know what can be made consistent, it's actually not that bad of a phase, and the first trio is the hard part, whereas the second trio was harder to figure out. First trio has a lot of things that can go wrong, and depending on RNG you can have a super easy time with this mechanic, or you're going to be sweating because of all of the mechanics that you have to do. For example, there are times where I just have to run to the safe spot and then just go to the final safe spot. That's it. But there are other times where I need to do the first dodge, then I have to yeet myself to the complete other side of the arena to bait a dragon dive, and then sprint right back to the other side to the safe spot, and then also drop my thunder AoE. So there's a lot of variance in what you'll actually be doing in this mechanic, so you need to always be ready to be targeted by the mechanics and then react accordingly to what you actually end up getting in the end. For Death of the Heavens, this is a mechanic that if you go into it with the idea that everything is random, it's incredibly hard. But once you know what is fixed, it becomes a lot easier. My group also went with the strat that made the mechanic so much easier for the split of the dooms and the non-dooms. And it's also what makes the PlayStation part much easier as well, because the 4 doom players have fixed positions here, and then the non-dooms need to just adjust to the doom player that they are partnered with. The only thing that needs actual on-the-fly adjusting are the 2 blue marker players, and that's it. So this is a great example of a hard mechanic to figure out, but an easy one to execute once you know what to do. Still quite easy to mess things up and cause a wipe, but certainly not as difficult as it first looks like. Phase 6 is probably the most unforgiving part of the fight. Up to this point, people can have died, and as long as you can push the DPS check, you'll most likely be fine. But as long as no one is missing for the following mechanic, you can recover and at least see the enrage of the phase. Here that's not the case. If a debuff doesn't get passed correctly, Nidhogg is going to enrage and start killing people. If someone dies to the damage coming from Haurchefant, he enrages and also starts killing people. So a minor fuck up could very easily lead to a wipe. The phase itself is really well designed though. You need to control your DPS so that both bosses are around the same HP each time Haurchefant happens. People need to be aware of when and where the debuff gets transferred, and there's some adjusting that needs to happen as well for the tank busters, the tethers that you get, and then also the debuffs for Rot Flames. But the whole phase has a really nice flow to it. Some timings on mechanics can be a bit tight at times, like for example the debuff pass after Rot Flames, but outside of that one small section, I don't think the mechanics happen too fast. The pacing is really good and it's a very satisfying phase to get through. There's also some nice lore tied into it, like for example with the Haurchefant in Rage. So it's probably one of my favorite phases altogether, from the mechanics to the story that is behind it. And that leads us into the final phase. This one looked like a victory lap. There's only 3 mechanics, but it's a lot tougher than we first expected. The tanks need to be on their game to make sure that they stay on top of all the tank swaps that need to happen. The mitigation also needs to be planned almost to perfection, because there's a lot of outgoing damage here, and healers will then also need to plan their heals really well. And then once you've done all of these things, there's still a fairly tight DPS check as well. As for the mechanics themselves, they are indeed not too difficult. It's mainly just the healing and mitigation that is going to carry you here. And the only mechanic that looked hard from a movement standpoint was Exa Flares. But once it was figured out that you could always do the same dodge, and if you face the boss north or south, you would also be able to make use of the markings on the arena to position for the safe spots, then it became a lot easier. It's still a tight dodge, you still need to be very precise with your positioning, but it's a lot easier than having to read the Exa Flares and then figure out where to go from there. Overall, it was still a really good closing phase to the fight, and it's not the easy victory lap that we were expecting. The Dragonsong Reprise has been an amazing experience, from the difficulty of the mechanics to the story that is being told. It was an exciting fight to follow the World Proc teams for, and it was also a lot of fun to proc it myself once my team was able to do so. And with this, they've set a very high bar for the next Ultimate, and I'm looking forward to when that one will come out. But for now, I'm going to enjoy my little break from raiding before our next Savage raid tier comes out in a few weeks from now, most likely. We'll still be trying to go for reclears of this fight, but at least now that prog is over, I should have some more free time that I will enjoy while I can, and then I'll be all rested up for when our next raid comes out. So let me know what your experience has been so far with DSR. Have you been progging it yourself, or have you been a spectator instead? And whichever one you might be, what do you think of the fight? Quite curious to see what you guys have to say. And with that, I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.